But it does
Yeah,
feel like a true partnership that we built over the years. Jan, I don't know if you have a thought on what you've seen in the differences there.
it's really fun to watch the differences when we're creating or designing or fulfilling something. Let's say we're putting it in writing. Todd will pull up a document and start typing right, like he'll just dive right in and start doing. And one of the things that I've learned and so deeply appreciate is that's part of his process. Like it's like talking it out, whether it's writing it out or what have you, and giving him the space to do that. Then we come back in with edits and probably take out anywhere between 20 and
20%.
40% of, you know, and then we do that rather than saying, no, no, don't do it this way, or I wouldn't do it that way. It's going back to this idea of creating space.
Hello, and welcome to episode 173 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we'll air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform. Leave a review. That would mean a lot to me. Tell a friend about the podcast. Help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Jen Kaye and Todd Weinstein share over 40 years of experience in leadership and professional development through coaching, consulting, and facilitation. As an extrovert, Todd enjoys painting a picture with as many words as possible, is a winner of the word count Olympics, and relishes in redundancy. An executive coach and team facilitator, Todd has a rich background in leadership and organizational strategy. As an introvert, Jen loves exploring the Rubik's Cube of human connection, is the author of The Overthinker's Guide and Savors Brevity. A master facilitator, language expert, and executive coach, Jen brings a rich background in executive presence and communication. Together, they are the co-creators and co-conspirators of Communicating with Confidence and Presence, a transformative learning experience for mid-level leaders who are at the pivot point of strategy and execution. After years of recognizing that traditional training or on-demand learning, while having short-term results, was not creating systematic or lasting change, they partnered together with the shared vision for a program that would change the way leaders approached executive presence. All right. Well, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, Todd and Jen. It's so great to have you both on the show today.
Thanks for
Good to be
having us,
here.
David.
And so we have business partners, and one's an introvert and one's an extrovert. And I think this conversation is going to be a lot of fun today. All right. So Todd and Jen, just tell us a little bit about yourselves and then how you started working together.
So it's really kind of interesting. Collectively, Todd and I have over, I don't know, maybe 30 years at least, right, of experience in HR, leadership development, communication through coaching, consulting, facilitation, all kinds of organizations. And what was interesting is we met Todd, correct me, where did we met? It was the ATD conference, I think.
Yeah, I think years back at an ATD conference, I was one of the participants in one of your workshops, and I had been invited by a mutual colleague and got to watch you in action and just really felt like I connected with some of the things that you were sharing and the way you were sharing it with the audience.
Yeah, so Todd and I, we ended up having this really great conversation and exploration, recognizing that we had similar philosophies around training and development, and recognizing that this idea of traditional training or even on-demand learning, while having some great short-term results, it wasn't really creating more systemic or lasting change. It wasn't really being sustained. And so we came together to explore this conversation. Todd, I'll let you talk a little bit about your background in leadership.
Yeah,
Well,
I think I remember a lot of conversations, long conversations, where the theme was, I think there's a better way to do this, than the traditional way of training. And I have a background in leadership development, organizational change. And so I was looking at it through that kind of organizational lens because I had been doing that internally for so long and realizing some of the things that, had been happening for so long in training, in quotes, were not leading to lasting results for people. They were sort of a one hit, great experience for the moment, and then people would return to their kind of typical way of leading other people. And what about for you, Jen, in terms of your background? I know it's different than mine.
Yeah, so my background is in language, communication, and somatics, performance. So it was really this unique match of two different lenses with an aligned philosophy that has become a really elegant, fun, creative, and collaborative partnership.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to getting more into that, into the work that you're doing together. But of course, first, let's talk a little bit more about introversion, extroversion. So Todd is the extrovert and Jenn is the introvert. And Jenn, let's start with you. So when did you figure out that you were an introvert?
This is so interesting because growing up, I don't think I ever looked at myself through that lens. And it's one of the greatest gifts where, as a facilitator, you're doing your own learning. As a coach, you're doing your own exploration. So it was actually in my own development that I came across MBTI and that whole idea of where we get energy from. And that was really enlightening for me because as a performer, as someone who my roles always were about serving people, it made a lot of sense that that's actually where I get energy from. So that when I get really quiet or I go internally to process information, it was just a huge connector. So that's where I first found out was MBTI.
Okay. And when I asked this, not all introverts struggle, but was it a struggle for you to introversion?
That's a super interesting question. I don't know that I've ever thought about it through the lens of struggle necessarily. I will say there was always an element of I feel different from the people around me, and I couldn't quite describe it.
Okay. And that's great. And I always want to say that not all introverts struggle with it. Some are just confident and know their gifts, and it's great. And then some do and are able to learn to embrace. And that's a lot of what this show is about. And then there's still some out there that need to embrace their gifts. What is a strength that you have because you're an introvert?
I think there are probably two strengths that I really lean into as the introvert. While confessions of an overthinker right here, I think the deep listening, I really take time to listen to what someone is saying so that I can really understand what's underneath, right? Maybe a little more root cause rather than the surface level. So one aspect is the listening, and the other is creating the space to be heard. So rather than injecting myself, I take that time not only listen, but process and create that space.
Yeah. How do you create that space to be heard?
You stop talking. That's the first one is really to stop talking, to remove the agenda about anything that they have to say being about you. And then that allows you to be fully present to the person in front of you and what their experience in that moment is. And by being present, then you bring the curiosity. And again, I think if we're talking about a struggle, one of the biggest challenges is removing yourself from that. It's not about you, it's about them. And that
Yeah,
helps create the space, if that makes sense.
absolutely. Yeah, so important. And then on this show, we talk about strengths of introverts, but we also bust some myths. Is there a myth about introversion you want to bust today?
I think everyone has their own version of introversion. There's no one way to introvert. It's not a one-shot wonder. So, if we look at what was on the Great Pyramid or the Temple of Alexandria, if I'm going to completely demolish the actual reference of know thyself. And when you know yourself and what it is that you need, so if it is that space or time to get your energy from someplace else, know thyself and find what introversion is for you.
Well said. I love that. It's really that's the whole key. It's about half the population are introverts and half extroverts. And of course, that means that we're not all the same. We have a lot of differences. And That's beautiful. Yeah. Get to know yourself and what you need and understand what other people need.
Yeah. And be able to ask for what you need. I think for introverts, especially, there's a pressure, maybe self-created and self-generated, that we need to show up and be present and have the behavior of extroverts. And so sometimes we'll push ourselves into that. Going back to the know thyself, when you recognize that maybe you need some space or time or to disconnect from people or spend time outside, to be able to learn how to ask for it, whether that's setting boundaries, whether that's finding the things and saying to your children, your partner, your boss, give me 5 minutes, or let me get back to you tomorrow, and taking the space that you need. I don't think we do that enough as introverts.
Yeah. And those are, you mentioned a couple really very important needs. Absolutely. Todd, we've had a couple of good conversations about introversion and extroversion. When did you first learn about the differences in our personalities?
Yeah, I mean, if I really go back, I'm the son of a clinical psychologist, so I think there was something in my early upbringing that always had me exposed to the differences in people and actually had me curious about it. I noticed early on that I had an energy gain from collaborating, from being in conversation, and that started to, get me aware of my own natural tendencies. I went through MBTI certification, and that's where I really got the language and the understanding of introversion and extroversion and where we get that energy from. The personal experience for me, the two things maybe that have been helpful when it comes time to extroversion versus introversion was leading a team of largely introverted people. When I realized that they didn't work the same way as I did, I couldn't just get a bunch of people in a room, start brainstorming and asking questions and expecting ideas to generate. And that realization came when one person came to my office at the end of a meeting going, if you want us all to be more involved in those meetings, you may want to give us a heads up about what we're going to talk about and what you'd like to maybe do some brainstorming around. Even a day or two in advance would help. So I did that, and sure enough, it was a completely different meeting. So I started to realize what the unlock was with a team that were largely quieter, more reserved, and I would say probably self-described introverts. That was a huge opportunity for me to learn what it really felt like to create more space. The other thing is, I realized as someone working inside organizations around talent and talent development and setting up people for promotions, there was a bias towards extroversion. And so with assessments and other tools, we really tried to shift the way we looked at who's ready to move up in the organization by not just being the person who's the loudest in the room, the most talkative, the most likely to speak up, because there were so many great ideas and perspectives that some of our quieter leaders had that weren't getting recognized. So working to do that. And then the last thing I would say is, I'm holding, I know your listeners can't see this, but this is a nicely printed business card that just says "Stop Talking" on it. And my colleague Brenda made those for her coaching clients, and she gave me one. And I literally keep it here on my desk because it's a good reminder when I'm coaching to, just keep my mouth shut sometimes and ask the question and listen. So that's been a really useful practice for me.
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely highlighted some of the key things that I learned. Like with brainstorming, sometimes we're going to come up with some great things together, like the collaboration, and I do enjoy it. But also, as an introvert, a couple things, I do some great deep thought and come up with great ideas on my own. And we have to look at both of those things are valuable. And the other thing is, you mentioned preparation. For me, that's key. If you want to discuss some things maybe I haven't thought of before, I need an agenda ahead of time. I need to know what's happening. And just understanding all these differences, that introverts, we think deeply, we think often before we speak. Extroverts, you said, you get an energy from collaborating. So I do sometimes, but in general, I'm generally gonna, think before I speak. So yeah, those are all such important things to understand.
Yeah. For me, it's the other way around, right? I'll say
Yeah.
something, it doesn't quite make sense. And then in conversation through others, it starts to make sense. I'll think about that and then I'll speak more. So I definitely notice that difference and Jen and I work differently and yet complementary ways. She recognizes sometimes I'm going to bring a lot of words into the mix. And I recognize sometimes just staying quiet and thinking about what she's saying rather than just immediately responding has been helpful too on my best days.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, Jen, but I want the things I say to make sense the first time around. Or you tend to be like that?
David, I am so much like that. And
Yeah.
I'm laughing. So one of my signature processes is how to communicate better in 10 words or less. And the process, it's 5 steps. The process actually allows you to internalize and connect with what's happening for you. It's what I call bridging that magical gap between what you think, what you feel, and then the words that actually come out of your mouth. Because I do need that. I want to be clear, and there's a lot that happens. So I work with a lot of engineers, and to me, it's just a system. How can I systemize what I'm thinking and feeling so that I can be clear in what I think it is that I'm communicating and feel confident about it the first time?
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. So definitely we're talking about some differences. And again, you're working together as partners. Are there other differences that you've had to learn to work through?
Todd, you want
Yeah,
to?
sure. I would say recognizing the differences in our styles. When we first started talking, at least from my perspective, Jen, it felt like we were philosophically aligned on things and we didn't quite know each other's work styles. So the more we got into working and developing our communication with confidence program and philosophy and tenets, the more we started to discover I'm going to bring in a lot of words more than I sometimes need to. Jen's going to be more quiet and thoughtful and then say, that well thought out idea. The other thing is we have different backgrounds. So I really have learned a lot from working with Jen around communication, succinctness, ways in which you can bring in your idea and express it for your audience. Whereas, I like to believe that I have helped bring in that lens of what is important for leaders when they're communicating throughout the organization, the differences in types of messaging that are needing to happen at different levels, but also a real appreciation and respect for those differences in a way that I think has allowed us to strengthen our programs, to create a good experience for our participants. I mean, everyone gets to see a little bit of something in themselves if they're working with both of us at the same time, because they can recognize if they're more, let's say, talkative or verbal processing, that there's going to be a little bit of me in them maybe. And with Jen, they may see and notice. Like I'll give you an example. Jen, I noticed this week. When we go to lunch breaks, I'm more likely to be sitting like with a group, chatting with 3, 4 people, like having a bigger conversation. And I look over and Jen's like having a pretty like in-depth exchange with one person. And so I think that's a really good example of just noticing, and everyone appreciates those differences because they're connecting with us in different ways.
Yeah, I can imagine that I've been through this. I've done some presentations with an extroverted colleague of mine, and I can definitely see how that was powerful for those that you're presenting to, where they can see differences and that it all works together and it's a good thing. There's no good or bad here. It's just
Right.
there's different, and we need to understand our differences. Like I'm going to be the same way. If in that situation there's a lunch break, I'm going to want to have some good, deep conversations. And I know somebody, not good or bad, is going to want to have a lot of conversations. It's all good.
But it does
Yeah,
feel like a true partnership that we built over the years. Jen, I don't know if you have a thought on what you've seen in the differences there.
it's really fun to watch the differences. So Todd will often, when we're creating or designing or fulfilling something, let's say we're putting it in writing, Todd will pull up a document and start typing, right? Like he'll just dive right in and start doing. And one of the things that I've learned and so deeply appreciate is that's part of his process. Like it's like talking it out, whether it's writing it out or what have you, and giving him the space to do that. Then we come back in with edits and probably take out anywhere between 20 and
80%.
40% of, and then we do that rather than saying, no, don't do it this way, or I wouldn't do it that way. It's going back to this idea of creating space. I think we both sort of observe where each other is and what each other needs. And rather than either fighting for the same space or approach, create the space and allow for it and yield and work with that. I think that's one. Todd, Was that
Yeah, I
articulated?
would agree. And the other thing I would say is I'm a fairly visual person, so that's why I'm often using models or things, and I want to look at things. And Jen, my sense of you is you have a fairly embodied sense of the work that you do as a communicator. So when Jen gets up and starts talking to a group, there's like a rapt attention on her because of her presence that I think really serves her well. And one might not know that she's more introverted because of the way she shows up in that way. But there's a lot of thought and a lot of under the current that's going on there before she is going to speak up in that way, and a very thoughtful approach to what she's going to say. I might have one idea of what I want to start with and then start talking and then bring in other things. So we have different styles, and I think people appreciate when we're facilitating what that looks like too, because it shows a bit of our personalities.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
sorry, dear, could I add this? Because I think it's interesting. So INFP here, and the feeling my way into things, as Todd was saying, it's feeling where people are at, it's feeling the energy in the room, it's assessing things. And then he and I get to come back. We have what we call micro adjustments in the moment, so that anything that needs to shift based on, both ENTP for Todd, INFP for me. And so that thinking and feeling, we get to adjust and make micro choices in the moment as to how to best serve others. So even through those differences, we model the extroversion and the introversion. We model male and female facilitation. We model what it's like to disagree in a really elegant way. And so I think all of those things maybe come together, David.
Oh, that's beautiful. And yeah, so I'm a thinking person too. And so there's definitely lots of different personalities. There's lots of different personality strengths that we have. There's lots of differences, nuances. And I focus on introversion, extroversion because I just see the issues that come with it. But thinking versus feeling, there's gifts there on both sides. But if you don't understand how someone's approaching from a feeling aspect where you can actually feel other people's feelings, and Todd and I might not so much, it's more of a logical approach. There could be a lot of misunderstanding there too. But if you can harness those strengths like it sounds like you both have, that's amazing.
We have a lot of
I won't always say it's always been easy. I mean, I think anytime you're in relationship with someone you're working with closely, you're going to have disagreements. There are different ways that you approach things. There may be frustrations. I also think the way in which we've learned to communicate those feelings or those thoughts with each other has been a testament to how we've gotten through those in a way that's helped make, our products better or our deliveries more effective. It's just like any relationship that, there's going to be moments where you don't always see eye to eye. It's the ability to work through those things that we've been able to do. And like Jen said, sometimes even modeling like in the room with people so they can see what that looks like in a healthy way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is all such good stuff. Let's talk about the work that you are doing. Tell us about CCP Journey.
Well, CCP is a quick way of saying communicating with confidence and presence. That is our signature program, and the Journey program is a transformative process that helps leaders transform the way they communicate and lead others. It's a cohort-based learning. We call it a journey because when it comes to all of these things, communication, leadership, confidence, presence, it's a lifetime conversation and a daily practice, not a, magical, like you blink your, cross your arms, blink your eyes, and you're magically confident and present and everything shifts. So we do believe that it's a journey, and it creates the opportunity for leaders to transform the way that they communicate for greater impact, starting from the inside out.
So tell us more about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add in a little bit. I think the other thing is it looks at communication not just through a single lens of like presentation skills or certain things that people sometimes equate to going to through programs like this. It looks at a much broader sense of communication. So when people are engaged in this program, they're thinking about all the different contexts with which they're communicating in meetings, facilitating, leading large efforts in dialogue and simple conversation with one other person, influence, all those things. And, the way they present and show up if they have to give a presentation to the executive team. So while it's getting at the executive presence, if you will, piece, it also helps people recognize how they're showing up everywhere. And sometimes the confidence they're feeling is related to the lack of clarity with which they need to express their message and who they are as individuals. So once they start to get clear on all that, we start to see them transform, as Jenn said, into a much more confident and present person, because they now know A, who they are, and B, what they actually want to say and how that relates to their broader context.
Yeah. And so I know you both were telling me you just came off a 3-day workshop. Obviously, we don't have 3 days here, but we would love to hear in a nutshell, how do you do this? What are the issues with communication? How do you overcome them? How do you help someone create confidence and presence?
I love this question because it's really not helping them create it. It's creating a space where they can access it. And so the stories and beliefs that they have about who they are and why they're there is really what's holding them back. And so by creating that space and connecting some of the dots for them, by truly creating an experience, which we think about it through the lens of self, others, and ecosystem. And while we could teach anybody how to stand, what to say, and how to say it, at the end of the day, when they don't believe it themselves, that's really where the breakdown comes. So it's not about the tactical aspects of how to give a presentation. As Todd was saying, when they can access their own authenticity and get clarity on what the stories are, what the beliefs are, what they think is holding them back, and recognize that that's actually not what's holding them back, they shift their entire perception of themselves in 2.5 days. Todd, would you say it's really between the afternoon of that second day after the presentations? So on day two, day one, we have sort of an introduction. Day two, they come in and straight out of the gate, they are giving a 3-minute presentation that is videotaped and given back to them for their own review, so they can access their own internal feedback loop by watching themselves, by listening to themselves. They get input from each other. Then Tuesday afternoon, we have a lot of content. And I think, Todd, this is that afternoon between the content and clarity and communication, asking questions. It's a little more tactical on, how to self-regulate their emotions, and then see that their leaders who have participated as well, it's a dual enrollment process, don't see them the way they see themselves. It completely unlocks where they come in, so that by the afternoon of the third day, they present again. They've only got 8 minutes to prepare. They have completely shifted. They stand and they're more confident. They're more clear in their messaging. Their presence is more relaxed. There are fewer filler words, and it happens automatically because they've accessed their own confidence and presence.
Yeah, I think 2 things happen on that second day, to your point, Jenn, that we really noticed this week as we have in other program deliveries. One is the awareness of the gap between what they were saying and thinking about themselves versus what other people actually experience, right? Because now they start to see an objective video of themselves and 11, let's say, pieces of input from others. And they start to see that I actually am way harder on myself than other people actually experience, or I felt more nervous than actually other people saw and experienced themselves. The second thing that they start to understand is some of the physiology and the brain science and the pieces around why am I doing that? What's happening in my body, in my brain, in my mindset that is holding me back from feeling confident? And once we start to put those pieces together, then by day 3, they start to see, okay, so now that I understand how to do this better, where do I want to go apply that? Well, that's inside my organization, or that's with strategy or influence or other pieces. Now I know where I can, channel that good shift in my communication style or my leadership approach towards having an impact in, the broader ecosystem, as Jenn said. So those are kind of the 2 pivot points that start to happen in this program from what we notice. The way that happens might differ by person, by style, by introversion, extroversion. But that's ultimately the process that's starting to unfold for them.
And how do you help them start that process? What's some examples of something that might be part of this workshop?
You were talking about your 5 steps. I don't know if you want to share a little bit more about those pieces or others.
Well, I think it begins when we look at the first step, David, it's giving them a chance to reference themselves. So we start with a pre-survey. We start with a pre-survey for both themselves and their managers. So, we have a baseline starting point. And Todd, I think that's where it begins because of the questions that we ask. So as an example, we ask them about their comfort level with different ways of communicating. Then we ask them 5 words they would use to describe themselves, 5 words they think others would use to describe them. And then anything that we might not know that you'd like to share with us. And that's where we get some really interesting and I think vulnerable information, Todd, of whether I'm an introvert or this is where I struggle or I have ADHD or I can't hear in one ear, or people really let us know so that on the background we have a little bit of personal insight. And I think that's the first point of reflection that they actually have for how we get them there is by asking questions. And it starts with that.
And we provide that back to them in the workshop so that they can start to see what they said was important, the biggest challenges they were having. We also help them tap into what they're like at their best. So another thing that really helps to unfold is not to make this all about problem, deficit. How do you leverage the things that you're already good at? What are the strengths, the gifts, the things that you already naturally bring? And helping them tap into their sort of at my best state also helps to rewire a little bit that tendency to always think, I'm doing something wrong or I'm not getting where I want, and changing the paradigm a bit. So that strengths-based approach also filters into that first day in a way that they have a very clear picture of where do they want to make a shift, but also what are they like at their best that they can do more of or leverage in a new way. And that is an empowering factor for them.
Yeah, I love that you're taking a strengths-based approach. I had another podcast interview this week, and many people on my show said they went through the experience of what's wrong with me, And my guest said, it changed that to what's strong with me. And I just love that, it's like, that's what it's all about. What are my strengths? And, you'll figure out your weaknesses, but if we can focus mostly on our strengths. So I love that you're taking that approach.
I think a strengths-based approach really is very complementary to even the idea of introversion. And that looking for looking for where you're strong first, looking where you're energized, what comes naturally to you. I have multiple certifications with Standout, and that it never ceases to amaze me that we're so conditioned to look for what's wrong, and most of us are paid, right, to bridge that gap and to look for what's wrong. And so the idea of looking at ourselves and looking at each other for what's going right, what's going well, what am I great at first? And often our strengths are something that's so instinctive and so natural for us, it would never even occur to us to think of it as a strength. So to be able to bring that approach in and reflect it back and have them recognizing continues to be a thread in helping them increase their level of confidence of going, oh, wait a minute, there are all these things that I actually do really well, which is how I got to be here, which is why I'm actually trusted and my leadership has invested in me to be here rather than looking at me as a problem to be fixed.
Absolutely. So when you're both doing presentations or communication type workshops, it really is all the different forms of communication, like you said, whether it's one-on-one or meetings or presentations. It's about the whole everything, correct?
Correct.
Absolutely. And we ask people to come in with specific examples of things that they're working on or the contexts where they're working so that they can use those, workshop them, and actually leave with plans on how to handle them more effectively. And they're often different. So they're learning a lot from each other, and they're seeing how they maybe have similar challenges or areas that they're working on, and sometimes B, where they have strengths in areas that others don't, and they can support and help one another, which is a huge part of the peer learning aspect of working with a cohort.
Yeah. And so I know some of these questions you probably could give me hour-long answers, but in a nutshell, what does effective communication look like?
You know, I was thinking about that question. The first thing that came to mind was you, David. I mean, you've done 170 interviews on this podcast, and I would be really interested to know what you have seen as effective yourself after so many of these interviews. And then I'd love to sort of come in on the back end of that.
Okay, so as far as myself or other people that I've talked with,
Right. As you've learned from these 170 interviews, was there a sense of what effective communication looked like from those?
well, just from the introvert extrovert perspective, I've definitely over many years now, at least 10 years, have learned that for me to be my best, I need to prepare my best. And you can't prepare for everything, but whether it be a meeting or even a conversation or the podcast, for the podcast, I put together questions and I send them. Often my guests are introverts. Todd, you're amongst the handful of extroverts I've had on.
Mhm.
And still the extroverts, some appreciate the questions. One extrovert that I had on my show said, "Yeah, I just want to be free. I don't want to think about it ahead of time," which is fine. I don't operate that way. And just really understanding that what do I want to share? And then there's going to be things that I haven't thought about, but then getting really comfortable with, hey, give me a minute to think about that. Or I'll talk to you tomorrow. Just really understanding that I think first, as we've been talking about, and then I speak. And also just remembering, and I think Jen was just talking about this, that what I have to share is important. You know,
Yeah.
if you're giving a presentation, guess what? It's because you have some expertise that, you're not being asked to give a presentation on something you're not expert in. So just remember that you have something important to share. And the other thing is, I don't know if there's any correlation with perfectionism and introversion, extroversion. I think we can definitely be harder on ourselves because we spend a lot of time in our heads. And just remember something else was, I'm not perfect. I'm giving this speech. It's not going to be perfect. I'm going to prepare my very best, but nobody's perfect.
Yeah. And so the short answer to that question in my mind would be maybe three things. One is the message transmitted, the message received, right? And if you're saying something that you think is clear and isn't landing in a clear way, and you don't know that, then you can think you're communicating effectively and you actually aren't. The second thing is, do you know your audience? Do you know the person or the group that you're speaking to in a way that isn't just coming from your point of view, but understanding, empathizing, appreciating what they're going to be receiving? And then probably the third thing is, do you know how to be in dialogue? Even if it's with a group, do you know how to ask a question and listen? Do you know how to create a two-way communication loop? Because sometimes people think they're communicating, let's say leaders I work with, and they're just standing up at a town hall going on for 45 minutes. Did they create any kind of interactivity? Did they listen and build in some of the input from people ahead of time? Or did they just stand up and talk with a deck for 45 minutes straight? So communication to me has some elements of those things, and being able to validate and verify that what we're saying is actually being heard and received, and that person feels heard when they speak up, is a huge part of that, and a big part of what I know I work with leaders one-on-one with, and we see that a lot in our programs. Jen, what would you add or look at differently maybe?
In light of our time, and to your point, David, before I step right down the rabbit hole like Alice in Wonderland, because I could have this conversation all day long, right? This is the geekery for me. So I think, Todd, you said that, and I'd like to acknowledge that you shared that quite succinctly.
Thank you. Lifetime practice.
Exactly. It's a lifetime conversation and a daily practice. No, I would certainly echo everything there. I think there is a stat that up to 70% of all communication can get lost between the sender and the receiver. And so the effectiveness of being able to be in dialogue, to ask questions, to listen, to do all of those things is especially important for effectiveness.
Yeah. And here's a related question. So yeah, I love how you said the message needs to be received. How is it being received? There's so many, everybody has their own lens that they're receiving that through. It can be a big challenge to reach many different people at the same time with many different needs and things. What do you say about that?
Here's what comes to mind, if I may. So my background's in languages. I majored in Japanese, I minored in Russian, I speak some Spanish, some French, and a couple other things. On a good day, I speak eldest child, which is different than middle or youngest child. I speak dog, cat, horse. Like, so my point being that, while I could go on, we all speak multiple languages, if you will. And just because we're all speaking English does not mean we're speaking the same language. And so having an understanding of the other person, as Todd was saying, that the context in which they're coming from, you're going to adapt your message. It's little bit like building a bridge. You might speak to a friend very casually or a family member and say things in a very different way than you would your key stakeholders or the C-suite. And so as that adapts, that was one of the things that I learned in Japanese. People would say, "Oh, it's such a hard language." It, it isn't when you look at there is such intentionality in what I'm saying and who I'm saying it to. And so that piece, David, I think in answering your question, that's what comes up to me is that if we can look at it through the lens of we're constantly in a state of translation. And if we can be curious about how someone else is communicating and why, and rather than taking that personally, I do speak the occasional male. It's a very different language. As a female, it does take some translation. It becomes so much more fun and so much lighter and so much more effective when you think of it. Doesn't matter if you say the grammar wrong or the pronunciation is a little off. The fact that you made even the effort to understand and speak somebody else's language consistently, I have seen over decades, is the fastest path to opening up that embracing of communication, right? That openness to it rather than a shutting down of it.
Wow. And just to kind of sum up, how can people be confident and have presence? How would you wrap that part up?
I think Jen said it before, this is a lifetime conversation and daily practice. So we need to continually be working on ourselves, understanding ourselves, and identifying the behaviors that are going to help us be most successful in communicating. Of course, joining us on a CCP journey is one way to do that, but just continually being humbled by the confidence and presence that people bring when they go through these programs by tapping into what they know they're good at, starting with those strengths, what's working, and then identifying what are the specific behavioral shifts using video and things like that, or even recording yourself on a phone conversation and listening to yourself after can be like a very simple way to notice filler words, interruptions, ways in which you're communicating that you don't even realize, but there's data there to notice. I think the other thing I would just share briefly is this is a huge opportunity. The pandemic had a way of amplifying the importance of communication and transparency and diverse communication approaches because of the way that people are now working together and making decisions. And we were looking at like a Grammarly Harris poll that estimated $1.2 trillion annual loss across US businesses for poor communication. So if people don't recognize that it's kind of everyone's opportunity to do something about that, then they may see communication as everyone else's problem but their own. So I think the way in which people get better is by breaking it down into small, clear behavioral shifts, mindset shifts, awareness of that internal and external state, and slowly starting to see that can make a huge difference in the quality of their relationships, their interactions, or their outcomes that they want, wherever that may be.
Yeah, I love that. So it's a lifetime work, but a daily practice. That's amazing.
It is. You're never there. You're never at some imaginary destination of there. We say this in our language often. Oh, I'm not there yet. Well, there is a constantly moving target. So it's learning how to appreciate here. And as Todd was saying, find what's next. We very strongly believe that communication in of itself, confidence and presence, these are essential or meta skills, not actually a soft skill.
Yeah. I could talk to you both all day. This has been a wonderful conversation. Is there anything else that either of you or both of you want to add today that you haven't already?
Oh my gosh, this has been so much fun. Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you, David, for having us and having a deep, meaningful conversation and dialogue. I've really appreciated it.
Likewise, it's been wonderful to be in conversation with you and with you, Jen, as always.
So your workshops sound amazing. Where can people find out more about the great work that you're doing?
We always believe that everything starts with the conversation. So our email is hello@ccpjourney.com. You can visit our website at ccpjourney.com. And for any questions, please reach out personally. We cherish that opportunity and believe that it all starts with a conversation and getting to know the person in front of us.
Sounds great. Thanks again, Todd and Jen. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to further connecting with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media channels. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. If you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there's now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the 4-letter Myers-Briggs code, and you can also have the option of purchasing the full report if you'd like to learn more. I'll add a link to the show notes. So many great things about being an introvert, and we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.